Hello again, boys and girls. Grandpa Pheardom here. We're going to continue with A Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 7, A Day with the Beavers. While the two boys were whispering behind, both the girls suddenly cried, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin!" cried Lucy. "The robin has flown away!" And so it had, right out of sight. "And now what are we to do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look, which was as much to say, "What did I just tell you?" "Shh! Look!" said Susan. "What?" said Peter. "There! Something moving among the trees over there to the left." They all stared as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable. "There it goes again," said Susan presently. "I saw it that time too," said Peter. "It's still there. It's just behind that big tree." "What is it?" said Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous. "Whatever it is," said Peter, "it's dodging us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's go home," said Susan. And then, though nobody said it out loud, everyone suddenly realized the same fact that Edmund had been whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. "Well, what's it like?" said Lucy. "It's a kind of animal," said Susan. And then, look, quick, there it is." They all saw it this time. A whiskered, furry face, which had looked out at them from behind a tree. But this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put out its paw against its mouth, just as a human might put their finger to their lips when they were signaling you to be quiet. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood, holding their breath. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind the tree, glanced all around as if it were afraid someone was watching, and said, "Hush!" Made signs to them to join it in the thicket, in the thicker part of the wood, where it was standing, and then once more it disappeared. "I know what it is," said Peter. "It's a beaver. I saw the tail. It wants us to go in to it," said Susan. Here we got a little picture. The beaver sticking his head out. He's not holding his paw up to his mouth, but he's there looking at them. Probably the first time that he looked at them for that picture. "It wants us to go into it," said Susan, "and it's warning us not to make a noise." "I know," said Peter. "The question is, are we going to go into it or not? What do you think, Lou?" "I think it's a nice beaver," said Lucy. "Yes, but how do we know?" said Edmund. "Shan't we have to risk it?" said Susan. "I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I feel like I want some dinner." At this point, the beaver again popped its head out from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly for them to come. "Come on," said Peter. "Let's give it a try. All keep close together. We ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy." So the children got up, close together, and walked up into the tree and in behind it. And there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, "Further in, come further in. Right in here, we're not safe in the open." Only when it had led them into a dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their burrows met, and the brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot because no snow had been able to fall in there. Then it began to speak to them, talk to them. We got one last picture of the beaver beckoning them in with his paw. Come on, get in here." But then it talked to them. "Are you the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve?" it said. "We're some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud, please. We're not safe, even here." "Why, who are you afraid of?" said Peter. "There's no one here but ourselves." "There are the trees," said the beaver. "They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but there are trees that would betray us to her. You know who I mean." And it nodded its head several times. "If it comes to talking about sides," said Edmund, "how do we know you are our friend?" "Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver," added Peter, "but you see, we are strangers." Quite right, said the beaver. "Here is my token. And with these words he held up to them a little white object. They all looked at it in surprise until suddenly Lucy said, "Oh, of course, it's my handkerchief, the one I gave to poor old Mr. Tumnus." "That's right," said the beaver. "Poor fellow, he got wind of the arrest right before it actually happened, and handed this over to me. He said that if anything should happen to him, I must meet you here and take you to—" And here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave one or two more very mysterious nods, then signaling the children to stand in really close around it, as close as they possibly could, so that their faces were actually tickled by its whiskers. It added, in low whispers, "They say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps he's already landed." And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do, but the moment the beaver would spoke in these fine words, it felt quite different. Perhaps it has sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels like you had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all of your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump up inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and you realize that it is the beginning of the holidays and the beginning of summer. "And what about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "Where is he?" "Shh," said the beaver. "Not here. I must bring you to where we can have a real talk, and also dinner." No one except Edmund felt any difficulty about trusting the beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. They therefore all hurried along behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest part of the forest. For over an hour, everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry when suddenly the trees began to get thinner in front of them and the ground to fall steeply downhill. A minute later they came out under an open sky. The sun was still shining, and found themselves looking down onto a fine sight. They were standing at the edge of a steep, narrow valley at the bottom of which ran, at least it would have been running if it hadn't been frozen over, a fairly large river. But below them a dam had been built across the river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that of course beavers are always making dams, and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he now had a sort of modest expression on his face, a sort of look people have when you are visiting a garden they've made, or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say hush this time, but merely, "A trifle, merely a trifle, and it isn't really finished." Above the dam was what ought to have been a deep pool, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice, and below the dam, much lower down, was more ice. But instead of being smooth on this, was all frozen into a foamy and wavy shapes in which the water had been rushing. As the water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came. And where the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered all over with flowers and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive. From a hole in the roof, smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river there was another small river which came down another small valley to join it, and looking up that valley Edmund could see two small hills, and he was almost sure that they were the two hills the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her company at the lamp post the other day. And then between them, he thought, Must be her place. Only a mile off or less. And he thought about Turkish delight and about being a king. And I wonder how Peter will like that, he asked himself. And a horrible idea came into his head. Here we are, said Mr. Beaver. And it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful and don't slip. On top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans a very nice place to walk because it was covered with ice. Though the frozen pool was level on the one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other side. Along the route, Mr. Beaver led them single file right on into the middle where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. Here we are, Mrs. Beaver, said Mr. Beaver. I found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And they all went in. Here's a picture of them going at the door. See that? Beaver's going to take them into that little house. And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was the burring sound. And the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth and working busily at her sewing machine. And from it, that was where the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. So you've come at last, she said, holding out both of her wrinkled old paws. At last, to think that ever I should live to see this day. The potatoes are boiling and the kettle singing, I dare say, Mr. Beaver. You'll get us some fish? That I will, said Mr. Beaver. And he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool to where they had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day, with his hatchet. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly. Looked hard into it, then suddenly shot out his paws, and before you could say Jack Robinson, had whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it again, all over, until they had fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat them, and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver, and from a barrel which stood in the corner of the house, and then to put into the frying pan and get the dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus' cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds there were bunks, like on board a ship, built into the wall, and there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof, and against the walls were gum boots and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and trowels and things for carrying mortar in, and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Here's a picture of Mrs. Beaver at her sewing machine, I think, as they come in the door. Hopefully that camera focus for you. She's got glasses on. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned them out in the open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and then put them all in the back of an empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dig out the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up to their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beaver's house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair beside the fire, and preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children. Mr. Beaver stuck to the beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter, in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as they wanted to go with his potatoes, and all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you can get it when it's been alive half an hour ago and has been out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought, unexpectedly out of the oven, a great and gloriously sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved his or her stool, or so to speak, away and leaned back from the table against the wall and gave a long sigh of contentment. And now, Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea toward him, if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit and going nicely, why, now we can get to business. We got another picture here. I think it's while they're still eating and before the tea. That's a busy looking picture. But they're all sitting around the table, food on their plates. Mr. Beaver still has the beer, so must be during the meal, right? Got my pipe going nicely. Why, now we can get down to business. It's snowing again, he added, cocking his eye at the window. That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, well, he won't be able to find any tracks now. And that's the end of Chapter 7. Fair winds and following seas. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye.